Hey there. I'm going to spend some time today talking about political competition in Russia. Let's start with the party system. As you, I hope by now, are aware, there is not a super long history of having a pluralistic, competitive political party system in Russia. 1991 really marks the beginning of the ability for parties to form other than the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And for those first 10 years or so, the political party system in Russia is really fragmented, really volatile. There are elections to the Duma in 1993, 95, and 99, and some statistics from those elections will show you a lot about just how weak and how rapidly changing the party system is. There's only three parties that managed to compete in all three of those elections. In 1995, there are 43 different parties on the ballot for the Duma, and almost half of the popular vote goes to parties that end up winning no seats whatsoever. In both 95 and 99, about 40% of the vote goes to parties that had not existed in the previous election. And there's only one party that wins more than 6% of the vote in all three of those elections. So all that, I think, should go to show you that the party system in that first decade is changing really rapidly. Voters are changing their loyalty. Politicians are changing their membership. Parties are not functioning in the way that they are supposed to in democracies, which is to convey information to voters about the ideology of the people that they're electing into office. That said, starting in 2001 and continuing into the present, Russia rapidly takes on the form of what we know as a one-party dominant system, which is to say there are multiple legal political parties, but the party that just happens to win basically every election, that unquestionably has the best access to power and resources, is a party closely affiliated with Vladimir Putin called United Russia. I'll get into some specifics about United Russia's ideology and then about the other political parties that are somewhat competitive in Russia in a moment. But first, I want to spend a little time thinking about this general question: why are political parties in Russia relatively weak? Number one, as I've said, there's a pretty short history of political parties organizing themselves independently. Russian political parties generally do not benefit from long histories or institutional memory or significant resources. And so history is a detriment here to political parties being able to exercise independence. Another possible explanation is that the legislature is fairly weak. Russia, as you remember, has a constitution which gives most of its powers to the president, who doesn't actually need to be a member of a political party, and who, in practice, often is not. The three presidents that Russia has had since 1991 have not owed their support to an organized political party, although some of them have affiliated themselves with a political party. And so the importance of political parties is somewhat limited, given that the power of the legislature is limited. Number three, voters in Russia don't appear to be super ideologically driven. Obviously, some of them have strong ideological preferences, but other voters will frequently they'll change their partisan loyalty, or they just won't express super strong preferences about policy issues. And that makes it kind of hard to organize a party around a specific policy agenda. Finally, and we'll talk about this plenty during this lecture, increasingly, especially under Vladimir Putin, there's been active measures taken by the government to suppress political competition. And obviously that's going to make it difficult for particularly an opposition party to have a particularly good hold on power or ability to change things. All right, let's focus a little bit on that party, United Russia, which has controlled so much of Russian political office in recent years. United Russia is what we know as a party of power, and there's a number of these that are formed in those first 10 years of post-Soviet Russian history, and their basic function is to serve a specific political elite. So when we're thinking about parties of power, politicians tend to create these parties and not the other way around. They're often not super ideological, they're often wrapped up in particular patronage networks or client networks, and they're often affiliated with a particular politician or a particular political elite. United Russia has effectively been in control of the Duma since 2003. Here's the backstory. So in the 2000 elections, a party called Unity is formed to support Vladimir Putin, who is the designated successor to Boris Yeltsin. He has recently been named prime minister. Then there's a different party of power called Fatherland All Russia that's formed by a coalition of governors in various Russian regions. The Fatherland Party does well in the 1999 elections for the Duma, and this is kind of a threat to Yeltsin and to his inner circle and to the ability of Vladimir Putin to take over and to be able to push through his legislative agenda once he wins. After those elections, the Unity Party only controls 18% of the seats in the Duma. But so the way that the Unity Party, the way that Yeltsin's clique and Putin's clique decide that they're going to deal with this problem is by reaching out to the Fatherland All Russia Party to suggest a merger, to essentially try and co opt these regional political elites and say, we can grant you access to power and resources if you agree to support this unified party. So in 2001, we have the formation of a new party of power called United Russia, and this party has been dominant in Russian elections ever since. It's also had the effect, by the way, of allowing Russia's executive to only really deal with one political party's legislators in the Duma, rather than trying to build coalitions of across a variety of opposition parties. Um, Ideologically, United Russia is pretty diverse. There are more liberal and conservative factions within the party, but this is kind of intentional because it needs to be a big party in order to keep a wide variety of Russia's political elite invested in the party and to stop them from breaking away. United Russia has really emphasized its ability to promote political stability. That's appealing to lots of people who lived through the chaos of the late Soviet years and the early Yeltsin years. It's also increasingly under Putin attached itself to this ideology of Russian nationalism, of sort of making Russia great again. And coupled to that is an embrace of so-called traditional values, including a strong association with the Russian Orthodox Church. In effect, United Russia is Putin's party. Interestingly, and this often surprises people, Putin has never actually himself been a member of United Russia, but he was the chair of the party from 2008 to 2012 when he was the prime minister of Russia, and he regularly shows up at the party's conferences. But it's just worth noting, Putin doesn't really owe United Russia anything. It's a vehicle for him to maintain control, particularly in the legislature and in local elections. But he didn't come up through United Russia, and so this is Putin's party. Putin is not of United Russia. United Russia is really more of Putin. Okay, before I get on to other parties, let's run through some results from the Duma elections. I'm just going to show you these in graphic form and give you quick numbers for United Russia only. So in 2003, the first election that is contested by United Russia as such, they get 223 seats. That is just shy of a majority, but it's definitely enough for them to push Putin's legislative agenda through with cooperation from some of the smaller parties. In 2007, they're going to increase that majority to 315 seats. That's pretty considerable, and notably, it's more than the 2/3 threshold for a lot of for constitutional amendments and other major changes under Russia's constitution. In 2011, this is a hotly contested election. United Russia actually suffers and goes back down to 238 seats. We'll talk more about the 2011 election cycle in class. But then in 2016, they come back and win 343 seats. So again, a really significant majority. The next election is in September 2021. It's just worth noting at this point, Duma, the length of a term in the Duma has been changed to 5 years. So if you're noting some inconsistency in those dates, that's why. As you'll note from this, United Russia is definitely winning pluralities in all of these elections. It's not particularly close. There is not a party that's really contending for a plurality or a majority in the Duma other than United Russia. But opposition parties do exist, and sometimes Americans are surprised to hear that about Russian politics. So let's walk through a couple of the major contenders for power. The most consistently successful opposition party dating back to the Yeltsin years is called the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, the CPRF. The old Communist Party of the Soviet Union was actually banned under Yeltsin in 1991, but its Russian version is reconstituted in 1993. Unlike a lot of communist parties in other post-Soviet countries or other formerly communist countries, the CPRF is still pretty committed to communism, and as such, it attracts support mostly from older voters who remember the communist years relatively fondly, and from some members of the working class. They are, however, still fairly loyal to Putin. They don't directly attack Vladimir Putin. Sometimes they will break with Putin, notably over kind of bread and butter issues that affect older voters and that affect the working class. But they're often frequently supportive of Putin's legislative agenda. The next party is called A Just Russia. That's just as in justice, not just as in only. This is a kind of center-left party, almost social democratic. Their emphasis is on social justice and economic equality, but they're not. They don't heed the sort of classical Marxism embraced by the CPRF. There have been a couple of so-called liberal parties, meaning pro-democracy and also pro-market, so economically and politically small L liberal. One of those is called Yabloko, which I think literally means apple. It's a abbreviation for the founders' names. And then there's another one called the Union of Right Forces, which was a coalition that was active in the early Putin years. Both of these parties have really declined in power. Neither of them has had a seat in the Duma since 2003. And they've really suffered. They've been critical of the Putin government's shift towards authoritarianism, and they've really suffered as a result, I think, of that criticism. One last party to note is called the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, which is neither liberal nor democratic, but it is a party and it is very much of Russia. This is a really hard right wing party. They express this very ethno-nationalist view, often using a lot of anti-Semitic tropes to try and make their case to the voters. They're pretty strongly anti-Western, and they're also pretty strongly pro-Vladimir Putin. If anything, they want him to be a little bit more Putin-y than he already is. Their leader has called for, among other things, annexing Alaska, expelling Chinese immigrants from Russia's Far East, introducing a monarchy back into Russia, and legalizing polygamy in order to boost Russia's population growth. These guys are really out there, but they do consistently win some number of seats in the Duma at every electoral cycle. The common theme here, with the exception of those small L liberal parties that have largely failed to succeed in political competition, is that these are loyal. These parties are members of the loyal opposition. They're not calling for a total overhaul of Russia's political system, and a lot of them consistently vote for whatever bills Putin's government has proposed. In exchange for that, they are tolerated, they're allowed to compete. There are some suspicions in some elements of Russian society that some or all of these parties are actually effectively backed by the Kremlin, that Putin and his cronies have lent their support, or at least their tacit endorsement to these parties in order to try and maintain the veneer, the appearance of political competition. But these parties are not an effective, by and large, are not going to present a really serious threat to Putin's power or to his legislative agenda in the Duma. So, how is it that Russia's government has managed political party competition in a way that allows it to have multiple political parties, but also to have pretty unchallenged dominance, both at the national and the local level, for united Russia? A couple of different legal mechanisms here. Number one, party registration requirements. After 2012, after some protests in 2011 and 2012, Russia's laws were actually liberalized concerning forming and registering political parties, but it's still fairly difficult to get on the ballot. There is a far from independent election commission that needs to declare every party legal before it can run candidates for office. If you want to run for the Duma as an independent candidate in a single member constituency, you need to collect 15,000 verified signatures in a period of something like 45 days, which is a pretty high bar to clear. So it's difficult to get on the ballot, whether as a party or an independent candidate. Criminal charges in Russia are often strategically used to render threatening candidates ineligible to run. Remember that in Russia, we have the situation of rule by law rather than rule of law, meaning that the laws, often really vaguely written ones, can be applied selectively to eliminate political opposition from contention, to disqualify them from the ballot. Most recently, in the 2018 presidential election, an anti-corruption activist named Alexei Navalny declared his intention to run and was quickly disqualified based on an old fraud conviction. Number three, I'll say more about the media a little bit later in this lecture, but right now I'll give you the short version, which is that it's difficult for opposition parties to get access to the media, particularly to television, which is where a large share of Russians get their political information. And that makes it difficult for them to win votes. Number four, electoral rules, in particular on the proportional representation half of Duma elections, the 5% threshold for getting your party in power, make it difficult for opposition political parties to really cross that bar and actually make it into the Duma. And then, as you know, in order to run a candidate for president, a political party has to be represented in the Duma. So that limit on legislative competitiveness also functions as a limit on competitiveness in the presidential elections. Finally, local elections, particularly for governors of subnational units, are relatively constrained. A reminder, I think I talked about this in the regime lecture in more detail, but those elections were canceled altogether in 2004. They were brought back in 2012, but in many regions since 2013, they have been optional. So local legislatures can say, we can just dispense with this election and instead just pick a candidate from a list given to us by the ever helpful and thoughtful folks at the Kremlin. So all those rules have functioned to make Russia, even though it has regular elections, even though it doesn't totally rely on just straight out election fraud in order to assure the desired result for the ruling party, all of these things mean that we frequently refer to Russia as a managed democracy or an illiberal democracy, meaning that you get to vote, but the outcome is not going to be a huge surprise. Moving on to civil society. So in the 10 or 20 years after independence, there was a considerable liberalization of civil society, and you start to see a lot of non-governmental organizations emerge. And that starts even before the fall of the Soviet Union, with some political liberalization, particularly under Gorbachev in the 1980s. The economic turmoil of the Yeltsin years is going to put a dent in the ability of people to join and form interest groups and civil society organizations. But then, even in the early Putin years, non-governmental organizations continue to increase in number and in activity level. That said, more recently under Putin's administration, there have been a number of constraints imposed on non-governmental organizations, particularly those that Putin sees as being a threat to his rule. Number one, the bar for registering, and you have to register in order to legally operate as a non-governmental organization in Russia, is really high. Various aspects of that system of rule by law can be used to intimidate or to disqualify civil society organizations. So if you are trying to lead a civil society organization and you've been critical of Putin, you might find your personal taxes or your organization's taxes suddenly being audited all the time. You might find the police harassing you for some minor violations or no violations at all. And then finally, there are restrictions on foreign funding that were imposed, I think, after 2012. There's been a couple of escalations in these laws. And so organizations that get significant amounts of foreign funding are now required in Russia to register as foreign agents and to put some notice that they get a lot of money from foreign donors on their printed materials, on their websites, et cetera, et cetera. That makes it difficult for them to raise funds. It undermines their public image. It plays into this broader argument that Putin likes to make, which is that his political opponents are really just, lackeys of the West or agents of Western intelligence services. And failing to follow these regulations is a crime in Russia. And so if you don't disclose your foreign funding as an employee or as a leader of a civil society organization, you can actually end up in jail. As I have said before, as I will say again, Putin has turned to Russia's historically close relationship with the Orthodox Christian Church to try and legitimate his rule. And he's really tried to position himself in public as a defender of Orthodox Christianity. You'll see restrictions on some other religious organizing in Russia. There are not formal laws governing freedom of conscience. And in particular, there's a considerable number of religiously active Muslims in various parts of Russia. But that kind of state alliance with Orthodox Christianity has some chilling effects for other religious organizations and for people who embrace values that aren't consistent with the teachings of Orthodox Christianity. In particular, Putin's government has increasingly turned to scapegoating LGBTQ people in Russia as so-called foreign agents, as the cause of moral degradation in Russia, which we will talk about more in class. Number three, the media in Russia. This is one of the sectors in which the government has really managed to extend its control under Putin. Traditional media, by which I mean TV, radio, and newspapers, are subject to a pretty high degree of state control through a variety of mechanisms. There are a couple of media outlets, particularly in television, that are just directly owned by the state. There's a number of others that are owned by holding companies, but the Russian state owns the majority of shares in those holding companies. And then there's others. So, for instance, Russia has three major national television channels. One is just directly state-owned. One is owned by a company in which the Russian state is a majority shareholder. And then the third one is owned by an energy company called Gazprom, which is in turn very closely allied with the Kremlin. One possibility, one other way for the state to exert control in the media is by pressuring advertisers. So if a newspaper or a radio station starts publishing or distributing content that's too critical of the government, one thing that the state can do is put pressure on its political allies in Russia's business community to not buy advertisements there. Sometimes the state will impose these kind of vague and broad regulations on content. So there are laws in Russia that criminalize the distribution of extremist content and of pornographic content, but the laws banning those activities are really poorly defined. And so that kind of vague legislation can be used in the criminal justice system to kind of selectively target political opponents. Finally, all of this kind of threatening environment for the free press in Russia will also lead many reporters and editors to just censor themselves, to restrict themselves from expressing political opinions that they know will get themselves or their organizations in trouble with the government. The situation is a little bit more complicated with respect to the internet and social media. I think it's probably unnecessary to say this in the context of a high school class, but social media and the internet are widely used, and particularly widely used among young people in Russia. There is a kind of domestic Facebook alternative called VK, VKontact, which is pretty widely used. LiveJournal is a popular blogging platform. And these kinds of tools have become valuable tools for political opponents. In particular, the anti-corruption activist Alexei Navalny partly achieved national prominence by using social media, particularly LiveJournal and YouTube, before the state really caught on that they should probably be censoring this if they wanted to suppress political opposition. And so the spread of the internet, the spread of social media have absolutely allowed opposition figures to organize in ways that it's a little bit harder for the state to repress. That said, more recently, Putin's government has increasingly attempted to regulate and to censor the internet, particularly by intervening through internet service providers. And so that's something to keep an eye on if you're interested in whether Putin's going to be able to maintain control indefinitely in Russia, is to figure out exactly how effective his government's attempt to gain control of political information over the internet are going to be. That's it. I will leave it there. Thanks.